Good afternoon and welcome to our session today on what you need to know about the Apprenticeship Levy. So I'm going to allow Nicola to introduce herself, but what we're going to try to do today is to give you an overall update of what we've learned over the last year to do with the levy, and also to give you some what we think is some really valuable information on where we go from here. So I'm going to let Nicola introduce herself first.
Thank you. Hi everybody, my name is Nicola Luke. I previously worked for HP for 18 years. Took the opportunity very recently to leave after a long time developing their strategies around next generation, spending a great deal of time doing the trailblazers on apprenticeships, and now a freelance consultant supporting organisations of all shapes and sizes really to try and figure out how best to use the Apprenticeship Levy towards their L&D strategy.
My name is Anna Shaw and I'm a manager of customer success learning consultants or managers at Skillsoft, and we work with customers on a daily basis on helping them with their learning strategy. I have an apprenticeships background, so I work with a large apprenticeship organisation for 6 years, so I have a really good understanding of that, and a really good understanding, I hope, on how using content and blended delivery can really help the apprentices in the workplace. So I'm going to let Nicola do most of the hard work today, which is my style, and then I'll just end off at the end. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Okay, let's jump straight into the slides, because I want to just walk everybody through the evolution of apprenticeships. And especially for those of you who are not living and breathing apprenticeships, this is quite a useful slide. So back in the day, they were very much framework driven, so assessor-led, very heavy on off-the-shelf type qualifications, not very flexible and not always role specific. And some may say a big tick box exercise. Then we've gone through this revolution of the Richard Review in November of 2012, which really turned apprenticeships upside down, shook them out, and pretty much placed everything on the table for review. The big difference with that review was that employers were placed very firmly in front of that review and leading that review. Hence the trailblazers that we all know and are becoming more and more familiar with. But the trailblazers really started to consider every aspect of apprenticeships, how we're funded, how much is available, and for each and every strand of qualification, what should be the limit of that qualification around the funding. Age was discussed, and now we know that age is no longer a limitation, which is absolutely fantastic, but there was lots of other things. Are the qualifications fit for purpose? Which was a very big discussion, and again, that's why the trailblazers have been successful, that they've started to review all those qualifications, and the way that even down to how the qualifications are assessed and how often they need to be assessed. And then, came about the whole concept of the new Apprenticeship Levy and the way that all of our qualifications now around the apprenticeship model are centred around new requirements, new funding, new limitations, and a new set of standards. And with that comes a lot of confusion. And anybody who has been living and breathing the new standards and the new levy requirements, there has been quite a deal of confusion for employers and training providers trying to support those providers through the process. And what we're going to try and do today is just really try and lift the lid on a couple of those key processes and try and give you a little bit of more information. And I've got some advice at the end of my slot of the presentation as well. But what we've got is, let's just do a very quick recap, again, just for anybody who's not living and breathing this subject, around what is the Apprenticeship Levy. So the government set this target. Some may say it's not realistic. Others may say that if we all embrace apprenticeships, then we will get there with that 3 million target. But it's about trying to commit to 3 million by 2020. Why? Because apprenticeships are actually very useful. For any of you that might be sat in the audience who are still a non-believer around apprenticeships, they are very useful to an organisation, allow you to grow your own talent, fill in skills gaps. they're not a short-term solution. They are something that requires investment. The shortest amount of time you can go through qualification is just 13 months. The longest, 4 to 5 years. So they're not a short-term knowledge gap. They are something that employers will have to invest some time and energy around, but that's got to be worth it because you're investing in that future talent. So that's for me. I'm very optimistic about the 3 million. I'll give you some figures on where we're up to against that target in a second, but let's just remind ourselves of the basic rules, whether or not you're a levy-paying employer or you're not. So the basic rule is you need to have a £3 million pay bill, an annual pay bill, and that's everything that you're reporting through the PAYE system. Now, the government will tax you or charge you 0.5% on your monthly pay bill that's going through that PAYE system. And you get an element of that back in England available through the new Apprenticeship Online account for you to access as the employer. So now that's putting the employer firmly in front and in charge of how they fund their future apprenticeships, who they spend that money with, and how they spend that money. But as long as they're spending that money on apprenticeships, the delivery of those apprenticeships, and the assessment of those apprenticeships, then the government's very happy. For Sunderland, sorry, not Sunderland, because that's actually where I'm from, but for Scotland.
It works really well in Sunderland.
I must have been thinking about home there. But Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, what we've got is slightly different rules for the employer. Unfortunately, you can't access that funding through this Apprenticeship Online account. You've got to still work with the funding agencies in those areas of the country, or certainly work with a training provider who may have a funding contract in those locations. So that's a little bit of a shame that we're not one nation on this, but that is the situation right now. So, the fact that apprenticeships have grown arms and legs allows us as an employer to really consider where do apprenticeships fit in our business. So it's an opportunity to stand back, take stock of how can I utilise all of these opportunities now, from a basic traineeship right through to a master level qualification. So we're talking postgraduate. I could be using them here for new hires. I could be using them for qualified staff, existing staff to upskill and reskill. I could also be using them for return to workers or people wanting a career change. Lots and lots of opportunities. And what we've currently got is around 220 new standards out there at the moment, fully approved and waiting for people to use them, with more than 300 going through that trailblazer review process yet to be approved. Those numbers are changing on a weekly basis. If you're a little bit nerdy and you're checking the apprenticeship or the Institute Apprenticeship website on a regular basis, those numbers are changing weekly. So they're doing a grand job in trying to get those standards out and released, but it's taken a little bit of time. Where are we so far with some of these numbers? So, 2016-17 academic year indicates 494,900 new apprenticeships. Not bad at all. And that's just a small drop of just 2.8% from the recorded starts in the previous academic year. Nothing too crazy going on there, as you'd expect. However, what we then see is a drop, and this was just recently announced by the BBC actually, who recorded this first, then CIPD and people management and lots of other people have jumped on the news of this, but 26% drop in the first quarter of this academic year for new starts, as opposed to in direct comparison to the previous academic year. Now why? There could be a couple of reasons. The first quarter of academic year 16-17, there was a huge rush to get apprentices started on the old frameworks, under the old rules, okay? So that could certainly account for a little bit of a drop in this first quarter. Also, I think it's fair to say that employers are a little bit confused still about where to go with apprenticeships. Making some decisions have been a little bit slower. And also, I think, it's a possibility that some employers are sitting on the fence still and maybe head in sand situation around the apprenticeship levy. So I think that 26% is realistic. Obviously, it's been recorded, but I think there's a fair reason for it. There's been a big increase of 37% in all of those apprenticeship starts targeted around the higher apprenticeships and some degree programs. And again, I think this is a positive step. Some may say apprenticeships are purely just for the young people, 16, 18, 19, 20, but of course apprenticeships now, the age limit is removed and we can be using it right across the board. So for an employer looking to upskill and reskill their existing workforce, that's probably where some of that is going. It could also be that students are looking at their options now. They're getting better educated on the options available to them. It's not just university, and that they can learn and earn at the same time and do a full degree program with an employer. So that's a good positive result as well. The apprenticeship starts since May of 2015 when the clock started on the levy, on the 3 million target. We're now standing at just over 1.1 million. So we've still got a little bit to go, but that's 37.3%, so just, give or take less than half. So there's still a huge amount of work to do in the next couple of years to try and encourage and support employers about the value of apprenticeships. And just, flicking back to this slide, really exploring the opportunities of where apprenticeships make sense for them. And why not, especially as a levy-paying employer, why would you not want to try and recoup some of that from the government and have access to that funding? Now, what are the employers saying? Interestingly, 50% of the levy payers want to see it replaced by a training levy. A very interesting statistic. Now, what that would mean is that we drop the word apprenticeship. Okay, so that would mean that the levy could then be utilised on every aspect of training and development and not just apprenticeships. So lots and lots of employers wanting a lot more flexibility around that funding. Whether they're going to get it is something, who knows. But for now, it is what it is, but 50% of employers want something different. 17%, so only 1 in 5, support the levy as it is today and the current processes. But again, that could be because of some confusion, not being supported properly, or not being able to make those decisions just yet around how they're going to spend that levy. 19% of levy payers, including 35% of SMEs, don't plan to use the levy at all. So they're paying it through their PAYE system, but they're not going to claw that money back and reinvest it into their L&D strategy. That for me is such a shame. 22% of all employers don't know if they're liable yet to pay the levy. Now that's an easy calculation. So again, I'd be encouraging those employers to just work with your HR and finance teams to find out whether you're actually one of those employers who have to pay that levy, because there's no way out of that. And then the final statistic there, 13% know they have to pay it, but haven't calculated the cost yet. Again, that's another confusing statistic for me, because I don't know why they haven't done that yet. And maybe, again, they're not receiving the right support. And a lot of employers don't actually have an in-house team with the expertise. So I'd be encouraging them to try and seek that expertise where they can. Now, interestingly, what I did was have a look at we're in London, so the London Chambers and Commerce industry reports that only 9% of London-based companies are looking to increase the number of their apprenticeships, only 9%. And more than a third are not yet aware of apprenticeship funding or indeed the levy. That's a little bit scary. So again, head in sand syndrome possibly, or just not sure who to turn to for some help. We had a look, Anna and I were brainstorming a little bit, and from some of the conversations that we've been having with employers, we decided to highlight a couple of the hot topics that are brand new because of the levy and the new apprenticeship reforms, but how are people working through some of these issues? So the 20% off the job training, interestingly, it's always been there. So anybody who might be in the audience who remembers NVQs, it was always there. You always had an element of off-the-job training. But what the government have done now is they've quantified it in 20%. So they've put a figure on it, okay? So that's always been there. So we talk about what you can do within that 20% and what you cannot include. The other one is endpoint assessment. Again, brand new because of the apprenticeship reforms. What does that mean? It's an independent assessment. So no longer is it good enough to produce a portfolio of evidence, e-portfolio or otherwise, to actually have an assessor or an internal verifier validate that as good evidence and all the standard is complete. We now have this endpoint assessment. Could be anything from a professional discussion to an actual written assignment, test, exam, so anything in between that. But all of that is documented in the associated assessment plans for each and every one of the new Trailblazer standards. And then we've got the provider and sub-provider rules, which has confused a few people, and thankfully the government have heard that, and their new guideline document has been updated, and it starts to clear up some of the confusion that providers have been having around that point. But let's have a little bit look in detail. So the 20% off the job training, it's essential, has to happen, you can't get away with it. And this has frightened, I think, put off a lot of employers. Can't have an apprentice because I can't have them sat there doing their job 100% of the time. And they've got to have an element of their time because the government's now telling me it's 20%. Well, it is, but it's always been there. So this includes some of the things around teaching, in classroom learning, exercises, online learning, e-learning, all of that is included. And that's relevant because they're learning new skills and learning and building up their new knowledge. Practical training, so this also includes the job shadowing, mentoring, industry visits, conferences, competitions, anything else that you're doing with that apprentice to upskill them, reskill them, and give them the necessary knowledge they need. Learning support and time spent building their portfolio is always also included in the 20%. What isn't included is their English and maths, if that's relevant for them, and that's because it's a different process and they're funded separately. Progress review, so for layman's language, the old assessor meetings or internal verification meetings, they are not included in the 20% off the job training. Now the reason for that is because they are about planning and managing progress. There's nothing in those meetings about learning new knowledge and skill. So that's why they're not included in that 20%. And nor is any training that takes place outside of their normal learning hours. Okay? The next hot topic is the main provider and sub-provider guidance. Been a little bit of a tricky one, this one, and it set out some huge responsibilities for the employer to be able to select and make the right judgment around the providers that they want involved in their apprenticeship delivery. So they have to select their main provider from the register that is available through the apprenticeship site. And that main provider that they choose has to take the overall responsibility of all the quality, all the training and on-program assessment for all of the other sub-providers that they may need to work with, that either the employer requires them to work with, or that the main provider needs to include some providers in order to take the learner from the beginning of the process right through to end assessment. So it's important that that main provider takes on that full responsibility. And I think that's scaring quite a few of the big providers because they take on the full Ofsted responsibility for that process as well. So because of that, there's guidance that that main provider must therefore have a legal binding contract with each of the sub-providers involved in that end-to-end process. So that the main provider also just can't sit and take the money or his share of the money and dish out all the work to the sub-providers. They have to be involved in part of the delivery of the apprenticeship, or at least the endpoint assessment. So they have to take on some responsibility of that end-to-end process as well. Main providers can use delivery subcontractors to complement, which I've said, at the request of the employer. So the employer, again, is right in the front and making the decisions around which sub-providers they want involved and where they want them involved and how much they want them involved. But there are some rules around the subcontractor criteria, and this is what some people have been struggling with. So the sub-provider criteria is that they've got to be able to meet at least one of the criteria on the board there. So you see the first one, that sub-provider must be published on the register of apprenticeship training providers. They are the apprentice's employer or connected company or charity, and again are on the register. Or, and this is the biggest one that's been confusing for people, they are not on the register, but can deliver up to £100,000 worth of delivery, support or assessment during that apprenticeship programme. Now, the initial confusion was that a sub-provider could work with 5 different main providers and earn up to £100,000 in any given levy year with all 5. That's what people interpreted initially. So that would mean they could earn up to £500,000 in any levy year. That isn't the case, and that's what the new document, well, the revised document or the updated document now very clearly states, that the sub-provider in this category for this criteria can only earn up to a maximum of £100,000 in any levy year across all main providers that they're working for. And that hopefully that just clears that up. But if please check the government website and you'll see that that's well documented now with their recent update. The endpoint assessment. It's been an interesting one, and I've even heard that some apprentices are registered on a programme and there's no endpoint assessment plan yet being approved. And that's a little bit worrying, because the endpoint assessment really needs to be in place, and the learner needs to understand how they're going to actually achieve the qualification overall, and how they're going to be tested, or their learning and knowledge is going to be validated right from the very outset of their qualification. And it should be written and included in their individual learning plan. So this is an interesting one. But again, the employer decides from the register who is that endpoint assessment organisation. The employer then selects that organisation, has that agreement with their main provider. Their main provider is then in a position to have a formal contract. So everything is agreed from the outset, not part way through, not towards the end when the endpoint assessment is due. It needs to be all discussed and agreed, and a contract in place from the outset. The employer then is obviously giving the main provider the challenge of paying the EPA organisation, so they're setting that task for them. So that comes out of the cost that's been agreed up front. Now, the government expect that the cost of the EPA is no more than the 20% that is allowed for that EPA at the end. Now, that's not to say that it's going to cost 20%. It could cost only 10% of that of the overall cost of the maximum funding band. However, if it costs more than the 20%, the rule is that the employer pays the difference. So anything on top of that 20% cost, then the employer then puts their hand in their pocket and pays the EPA organisation directly. So again, hopefully that clears up one or two aspects for anybody in the audience. Now, I'm one of the lovers of apprenticeships, as you can imagine, but there's lots of people out there that are also haters of the Apprenticeship Levy. And there's lots of negative news going round, and I think any one of the statistics that we've shared today, you could put a negative spin on it, the same way I've tried to put a positive spin on it. But I would just only ask employers really to start embracing apprenticeships, take a step back. You've got a real opportunity, even as a non-levy employer, you have an opportunity to tap into this government funding at only 10% of the cost of the programme. Only 10%. So an amazing opportunity, but some advice from me personally is to treat this as a high value service, the same way you would as a talent strategy, an L&D strategy, a workforce strategy, even a business focus strategy. This is also equally as important, and it should not just be looked at as in isolation of, we pay a £2 million levy, so how do I get that back? Because the organisation that you work for is just trying to claw that money back. It isn't just about that. It's a real opportunity to take a step back and actually validate how useful could this be for our business. And you'll start to realise that actually you could do a huge amount with it and actually connect with a lot of existing employees, as well as bring on the traditional apprentice into your business. So treat that as a high value service. Try and build that compelling story. Lots of people are telling me that's the biggest thing. How do you sell it to the business? Yeah. How do you tell them it's a good thing? And it is about generating that compelling story, pulling together the right detail that will resonate with your business. What makes that business tick? Is it facts? Is it about bringing in other employers who've got successful programs and getting them to tell them the success story? Or is it something different? But that's the first point, trying to get that buy-in from somebody within your business, and trying to find a senior sponsor is vital within the business if you can. Define that clear strategy. Where does it sit in your company? How does it support growth? And also, how can it prevent some of the challenges that everybody foresees? Find the right provider. Now, this is also potentially a tricky one and quite a substantial job, because there's lots of providers out there, and where do you start? The register's enormous. Where do you start looking for that right provider? Obviously, I would suggest your Ofsted inspection reports. Try and find other employers and businesses that are using that provider, and then start to look for some success stories. Are they good? Are they bad in real life? Because Ofsted is one thing, but what are their current practices like? Make sure you carry out a strong and robust due diligence. Try and get your procurement and finance teams to help with that, and just try to look at what is it you need from that provider, and therefore carry out the relevant due diligence. And put it out to tender would be another piece of advice for me. Don't just make a snap decision. Get it out for tender through the communication channels and try and get people to bid for the business, because you're treating it as a high value service within your business. So develop an inclusive recruitment strategy is another thing as well. This isn't just about trying to use the money, remember. This is about trying to make it attractive for your existing employees, how they can develop their careers, but also how to make your business, your company, look attractive externally. And then the final thing for me, as a consultant, but as somebody who has been there and developed strategies for a large global organization myself, I've learned a lot of lessons. And there's a lot of people out there who have read the government documents and are saying they're experts around the levy. They may well understand all of the requirements of the levy, but if you are treating this as a high value service, you may need a different kind of support to look at your big picture, to be able to help you define the right kind of strategy for your business. And that's me. Anna, over to you.
Excellent. Well, I obviously can't top that whatsoever, but I just want to say I am also a lover of apprenticeships. I love apprenticeships. I worked in apprenticeships for 6 years. I know how valuable they can be. I was very honoured to work with Nicola when she was at HP, and we recruited some individuals from backgrounds the lower than expected from some of the others we brought in, and they were an enormous success for HP, and I was really proud to work with them. But what's really, really important is that you are able to provide full support in your business for your apprenticeships. And it doesn't just mean mentors and people that they can go to talk to. It's also about giving them content that will support some of the apprenticeship training they do. So if you would just like to go to my slide. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit of a story about a company that we're working with. It's a large charitable organisation who have just adopted our new intelligent learning platform, Principio. Demos can be held on stand B6 later on if you so wish to. But what I wanted to say, so we've got 2 IT apprentices, 2 IT hardware apprentices. We've got Robert, who's a real IT enthusiast. And in the 3 months they've had the platform, he's consumed 495 pieces of content. And as said, it's fed back to us that this content is fantastic in the way that he's supporting the rest of his apprenticeship program, and he feels that he's got that added support because he's got that content there. So it's really important that you're providing extra support for your apprentices. You don't just say, go off and do your training with your provider. Give them extra support. It means everything to them. And we've also got Emily, who is interested in IT. She's an IT apprentice, but she's also really keen to work on self-development. So she's consumed 295 pieces of content. Some of it's IT, but predominantly it's about self-development. And I think that's fascinating to see between the two of them. So you go to the next slide, Nicola. So this is just a bit of background about Emily. I spoke to Emily. She's really excited about working in IT, but what's really, really important to her is that she learns how to be a professional individual in the workplace. How do I have those difficult conversations? How do I write a proper email? You know, all of those things that we don't think about, but it's just really important you give them content to support that. And that's just a little bit of a story and background on Emily. If you go to the next slide. And then we've got Robert. He is what we used to lovingly call our IT uber nerd. Absolutely can train our developers. There's no doubt about it. But the IT element is really important for him. Online content is essential for him. That's how he consumes all content. It's all books and e-learning, and that's what he consumes all day long. So it's fascinating. So if you just follow up on the next slide. So just to let you know, that Skillsoft have a variety of content in business essentials, IT and developer, and we've looked at the standard for the apprenticeship, and we've got content that supports and backs that up. So if you've got apprentices in any of these positions or other positions, and you're looking to have support content, companies like Skillsoft have that relevant content that can support your apprentices in the workplace. And that's it from us today. So thank you very much for coming.